This presentation will cover some of the very basics of how to give a good presentation in psychology. Now, we do lots of different types of presentations, so the specific format may vary. You may do a poster presentation in which you're presenting to a small group and it's more informal. You may do a formal live presentation to a larger group, or maybe even a recorded presentation. But I'm hoping to give you some tips that will help you kind of cover the basics and be broad enough that they can apply to any type of presentation. So the goal of any presentation is to tell a story. And as you're preparing your presentation, it's really aware that you think about what story or main idea you want to tell, and you start with this and you end with it. So you always want to start with the main idea. Often this may be a thesis, but that might depend on what the specific assignment is. But it's really important that you put this on the slide and kind of on a slide and emphasize this so that your listener knows. Then you'll go through your presentation, which should provide evidence for whatever your main idea is. And then you'll end by revisiting the main idea to make sure that your listener has gotten the point and really understands it. And so as you are preparing your presentation, always keep in mind that main point, that main story that you're trying to tell, and make sure you're linking things back to it. When you're preparing your actual slides, you need to be aware of a few things. First of all, you need to be very careful about what text you put on the slide. So you should not be putting a full paragraph. So if you're doing a presentation based on a paper, you can't just copy and paste from the paper. You shouldn't even have full sentences. What you want to aim for is phrases or key points. What are the main ideas that you're trying to get across in that specific slide? The less you put on there, the easier it is for your listener to follow. It's also really important to proofread. You want to look for, spelling and grammatical errors. Check your capitalization as well. These kinds of things can be distracting for your listener, so you want to make sure your slides are perfect. Also, you want to avoid distracting animation. So when your slides have a different animation every time you switch slides, that can be distracting to your listener. Similarly, if your text or your images are zooming in and out, that can be a distraction and doesn't necessarily add to the presentation. Now, there are times when you might strategically decide you want animation. So if you want a couple of phrases to appear later in a slide, you may set that up so that you have those later animations. But generally, I tend to find these animations can be kind of distracting, so I try to avoid them unless they have a specific purpose. You also need to cite your sources. So you need to cite your sources when you're writing a paper, but that is just as important when you're giving a presentation. So plagiarism can happen in presentations as well as in writing. When you take ideas from someone else and don't give them credit, even if you've paraphrased it, that is plagiarism. When you've taken words directly from someone else and haven't put it in quotations and cited it, that is plagiarism. So make sure that you're citing sources. Even if you just have a couple of words that are the main point from an article, make sure you are giving that author credit. And you should generally use APA style in-text citations within your slides. So just like if it were the text of a manuscript, you're going to use the author's last name and year to reference the source, and then you're going to create a references slide that has the full citation at the end of your presentation. Now, people probably aren't going to spend a ton of time looking at your references slide. You'll just have it up there. But if someone asks you more about a source, you have that information. In terms of graphics are okay. They should be appropriate and professional. Okay, so you don't want irrelevant clip art. So you need to make sure that it's relevant to what you're presenting. You don't want too many. So a graphic on every slide or a graphic that's covering the words can be problematic. You also need to be aware of where your graphics are coming from. So for example, if you take a figure or an image, a graph from an article that you read and you're talking about the article, you need to make sure that you are giving the author's credit and citing the article beside the figure as well. You also want to avoid distracting images that have movement and things like that can detract from your presentation. The narration is also important. So one thing that I often see students go wrong on is they just read the slides. Your oral presentation should add to what is on the slide. So you can either expand on the points that are made. So especially if you just have one or two word phrases, that really gives you an opportunity to expand and explain what you mean in the narration. Or you can give examples. So if I am listing a construct, a variable, then maybe I just write that variable on the slide and then provide examples of what that might look like in the narration. It's always important to remember that your listener can really only thoroughly process one thing. Either they can read your slides or they can listen. If you have an entire paragraph on your slide and your reader or your listener is reading, then they're not going to get anything that you say. So having very brief and concise slides and a narration that is consistent with what's on the slide means they get the same story. If you have a bunch of information on your slide, or if you're talking about stuff that's not directly related to the points you have on your slide, your listener ends up only getting half of the story and may end up confused. A couple other suggestions to think about. Consider the format of the presentation. What are the requirements or the expectations? Do you have a grading rubric or an assignment description that tells you exactly what needs to happen? Make sure that you are sticking to time limits and any other restrictions. If there are a limit to the number of slides you can present or how long the presentation needs to be, you need to make sure that you are sticking to that and rehearsing and practicing and editing enough to meet those requirements. And that rehearsing is really important. Even if you're not doing it live, it is still important to practice your narration as you prepare for a presentation. That will help you address potential errors or problems and be better prepared. If you have a live audience, it's also important to leave time for questions. That can be one of the kind of funnest and most exciting parts of giving a presentation, that you are able to engage with your audience. So make sure you prepare for the questions and leave time for the questions. Maybe have a question slide at the end of your presentation if you're presenting to a live audience.